What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. This is We the People podcast. My name is Brett Maurer. I'm the host, and this is the politics section of our podcast. So you are now listening to episode 2 of our politics section. Last week we discussed the second article to the U.S. Constitution, and we discussed the powers of the president that are listed there. And we also discussed the Bill of Rights and how the Bill of Rights and the presidency coincide together. So this week we're going to talk about a little bit more of a present political issue. So this week we're going to discuss the Confederate flag, a symbol of history, a symbol of betrayal, and for many, a symbol of racial injustice, while for others it is a strong symbol of heritage and expression. So first I just want to talk about a little bit of the history behind it. So for those that don't know, the Confederate flag was the national flag of the Confederated States of America. Okay, so what that means is that during the 1860s to 1861-ish, many states began to secede from the Union. So we had quite a few southern states, I think it's actually 11 southern states if I'm remembering correctly, left the United States and formed their own nation, which was the Confederate States of America. They also dropped the American flag and no longer flew the American flag. Instead, they flew the Confederate flag. Now, this obviously led to what became known as the Civil War, because two factions of the same nation began to fight each other for control of the continent. But oddly enough, a lot of people have started to consider it less of a civil war and more of a territorial war, because technically the Confederate States of America was its own nation. They had their own form of a constitution, they had their own national flag, obviously they had their own national army. So obviously we all know it as the Civil War, and we know why we call it the Civil War, but there are people that have started to argue that it maybe wasn't to be considered as a civil war. So the Confederate States of America, there has been a lot of discussion in the past about what did they really stand for. And the other interesting thing that this does is it allows us now to not only take what the flag represented in the 1800s, but what representations have carried with this flag to the modern day. Okay? And that is probably the most interesting aspect, because a lot of people, like we said, have decided that this is a symbol of their heritage, whereas other people have decided maybe that this is a symbol of racism or the symbolism of race superiority, things like that. And it's interesting to be able to talk about these things and to look at these things and just understand that these variations of kind of viewpoints that come from different factions of our society, but they all focus on a singular item, event, things like that. But like I said, in order to understand what this flag represents, we have to know what the Confederacy represents. So we discussed that the Confederacy were states that seceded from the Union. Okay. These were 11 states, southern states, that were extremely worried. Okay. And basically, it comes down to two issues. And this is what the two major themes for secession were. The first was states' rights. The southern states were extremely concerned about states' rights. Now, the reason they were concerned about states' rights is because they thought that the federal government was becoming too strong and was going to take rights away from the states. Now, we discussed last week that any powers not granted or specified to the federal government in the Constitution are considered state rights to be made. Okay? So obviously, let's take, for example, prohibition. Making alcohol an illegal substance was not a state decision. That was a national decision. That was decided by the federal government, and the Supreme Court upheld that the federal government had the right to make that decision. Now that prohibition is no longer illegal, rather, now that alcohol is no longer illegal, each state has the right to decide what the different requirements are. Okay? So, for example, some states, if you are below the age of 18, you can sit inside of the bar, but you cannot drink alcohol. Whereas in other states, you can sit in the bar and drink alcohol if you are the age of 21 or over. Okay, the 21, the age you have to be to drink alcohol, that is a national decision. But whereas some states say if you are below the age of 21, you can sit inside the bar, and where other states say if you aren't drinking age, you can't come into the bar. Okay? That right there, deciding who can and who cannot come into the bar, that is the state decision. Okay? So the biggest thing is they were worried about states' rights being compromised for a specific reason. And that reason was slavery. Okay? Now, that may be an unpopular opinion with many people, but it's the truth. Okay? It's undeniable. That's the reason why many states were worried about states' rights. Because a lot of the northern states no longer wanted slaves. Okay? They wanted to do away with slaves. But other states wanted slavery to be expanded. Okay? And the federal government was already coming to decisions on whether they wanted to make future slave trade in the United States legal or illegal. So it's important to remember that slavery and slave trade are two different things. You can own slaves, but if slave trading is stopped in your nation, then you can't get any more. You have what you have. Okay? And actually, Thomas Jefferson had written a section of the Declaration of Independence about slavery. He had written that the United States should make slave trading illegal and no longer be a part of it. Now, that doesn't mean that frees slaves. What that means is you can no longer buy any more. So once your slaves are freed or die or escape or whatever happened, you can't get any more. And the reason that's not in the Declaration is because Thomas Jefferson was advised to remove it because he was worried, rather, the people who were aiding him were worried that if he included that in the Declaration, then the southern states would not have agreed to go to war with Britain. Okay, and what we're looking at in the mid 1800s, it's a similar situation. The government is considering outlawing the slave trade, and some states are already removing it. Some states were not allowed to own slaves. That was their state decision. And some states wanted to expand the slave trade and slavery. And a lot of people you'll talk to will say that I am completely incorrect. Okay? A lot of people you talk to, not historians, because historians you're going to come to find most of them will agree with what I've just told you. A lot of people you talk to will argue that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War and that the Confederacy wasn't fighting for slavery and all this other excuses that are incorrect. It is 100% factual that the Confederacy fought to maintain and uphold slavery. That is an undeniable fact. Okay, period. There's no wiggle room there. It's undeniable. And the reason it's undeniable is because many people will tell you that the Confederate States seceded and fought for economic reasons. Okay, and I'm going to explain now to you why saying they fought for economic reasons makes it undeniable based on all the other evidence that they fought for slavery. So for one, it's undeniable that they fought for slavery because each declaration for each state, okay, each state made their own kind of declaration as to why they were leaving the Union. And each state that seceded from the Union, all 11, each made their own declaration, and each one of them has the defense of slavery written as a clear objective of their state policy. Okay? So let me give you an example of that. In the Georgia Declaration, there is a section that discusses the Texas Territory. Okay? So the exact phrase is, "This question was before us." This is in reference to anti-slavery feelings at the time. "We had acquired a large territory by successful war with Mexico. Congress had to govern it. How in relation to slavery was the question then demanding solution. This state of facts gave form and shape to the anti-slavery sentiment throughout the North, and the conflict began. Northern anti-slavery men of all parties asserted the right to exclude slavery from the territory by congressional legislation and demanded the prompt and efficient exercise of this power to the end." This insulting and unconstitutional demand was met with great moderation and firmness by the South. So here we see that Georgia is saying the southern states oppose anti-slavery motions, but due to the majority of states involved in the federal government deciding that they would like to see anti-slavery legislation in place, the South was now at jeopardy of losing slaves. So now let me go back and explain why slavery and economic worry are the same thing for the southern states. In the North, it is undeniable that the northern states, okay, it is 100% undeniable that the northern states were wealthier than the southern states. Okay, that is a proven fact. And you're going to find a lot of people would argue that, but you can't. Okay, it's the truth. The reason we know this is because the North was responsible for manufacturing. There were more factories, there were more textile mills, there were more processing mills. They made tracks for railroads and the railroad ties. They made the actual cars and engines for trains. They made weapons. I mean, furniture, everything that was produced and resold was pretty much made in the North. Whereas a majority of the southern states, okay, a majority of the economy of the southern states was agricultural. Okay, that right there is 100% undeniable. Even today, in the modern age, we know that the Midwest and the southern states are more agricultural. Okay, that's undeniable. We know that. We've all seen the movies where, the plane flies over and it's just all these different colors of squares of all the farms down on the ground. Where do we always assume that scene was filmed? Over the Midwest or over the South. The South and the Midwest are extremely agricultural, whereas the West Coast and the East Coast are extremely technological. They are extremely filled with manufacturing, especially states like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, or even some of the more rural areas in New York. There are a lot of factories and mills and things in these areas. The South did not have those. The South relied on agriculture. And part of that was the cheap labor of slaves. Now, that's not to say that slaves were cheap. Slaves were by no means cheap. Okay? People would go into debt buying slaves. But they relied on the slaves because if they didn't, they actually had to pay workers. It's very similar to the conversation we have now about immigrants from Mexico or other foreign nations. Everyone always likes to make the argument that these immigrants are coming to steal American jobs. Well, that's all well and good until you look at what the majority percentage of these immigrants do, and that's go out and pick food and vegetables and grow food and vegetables out in fields. Okay. The argument here is no different than the arguments with slavery. Getting cheap labor from foreign immigrants would be no different than a slave owner getting, I would say free, but it's not free because they had to pay for the slave, but getting cheap labor from a slave who they didn't have to pay. It's pretty easy just to feed and house and water someone like an animal. But when you have to start paying them fair wages, this was the issue. Okay? This was the issue. When it came to agriculture, a lot of plantation owners and farmers, they didn't want to have to get a bunch of white men because then they had to pay the white men fair wages. And then that put stress on their pocketbooks. But instead, they could go and spend, I don't know, $500, which you have to remember is an extremely large amount of money for the time period. And they can work that slave then for free for the next however long they live, 30, 40 years maybe. Maybe longer, maybe less. Everything can be found to be economic. But to say that the reasoning is economic, no. You can't do that. With the Confederate States, sure. Obviously, there's a lot of legitimacy to that. They relied on the slaves because that's what ran their economy. The Confederate States were what we called a slave economy because they relied on slaves to do everything in their economy. So you can say, yes, it wasn't about slavery, it was about economics and the unfair advantages between the North and the South. But when you really look at it, those economic issues that they fought over were solely based on slave labor. So those are the two major themes of the Civil War. Those are the two major themes of secession. Those are the two major aspects, viewpoints rather, of the Confederate States. They wanted state rights more secured. They didn't want to have to not be the majority. They didn't want to be the minority when it came to decisions like anti-slavery policy for the nation. And they wanted slavery. Period. Undeniable. There's evidence of it. There's textual evidence of it. And we can debate this all day long. I have no problem doing that. I love debating with people, and anyone who knows me knows that. But the difference between me and a normal person on the street is I'm going to start giving you sources. And if you can't give me sources back to defend your position, reliable sources, then that's no longer a debate. That's an argument. Debates are based in fact. And if you can't have facts to back up your words, then there's no point in speaking when it comes to situations like history and politics, which are so rooted together. So we have the two reasons as to why states seceded. And that gives us the symbolism of the flag. The Confederate flag stood for slavery. The Confederate flag stood for support of slave economies. The Confederate flag stood for the expansion of states' rights and the minimization of federal government power. Now, you may agree with that states need more rights, that the federal government should have less. But you can't just pick and choose what you want to see. The example I always give for this is the Bible. Many people argue that different aspects of life are wrong based on the Bible. Okay? I think the most common one that is discussed is LGBT rights. There are a large group of people in this nation that feel LGBT people should not have rights, should not have the ability to marry because it is quote unquote unholy. Whereas other people who are supporters of the Bible would argue that because the Bible says to love everyone and accept everyone and accept people for who they are and their flaws, that then it's okay to be LGBT. What I want to look at here is the nitpicking, the picking and choosing of different things. It's undeniable based on the text that the Bible says you shouldn't wear mixed fabrics. Okay, it says, I think the quote is, do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. And I think it's in Leviticus. Okay, I know that there's something in there about when women are menstruating, they are unclean for 7 days, and that whoever touches her shall be unclean. Okay, and that if you have a stubborn or rebellious son, that you were to take that son to the elders of the city and, explain to them that your son was stubborn and rebellious or whatever was wrong with him, and then all the men of the city would stone him to death. Okay? There's so many things that the Bible says that none of us take seriously anymore. We don't stone kids to death for misbehaving or being rebellious. We don't tell women that they're impure because they're on their period. We don't force them out of the house and lock them away so no one can touch them. Okay? Nobody on this planet anymore wears clothing made out of single material. Okay? I would push to say that 98% of the clothing on this planet is made out of mixed woven material. In fact, I'd put money on it that the shirt you're wearing on your back right now is probably 50% cotton. Okay? But nobody wants to talk about these parts because they find them ridiculous. But then they cling to any part that they feel says LGBT people are not holy or are not right, even though nowhere in the Bible does it specifically say that. And this is my point, okay? This is my point when it comes to the idea of the Confederate flag not representing slavery, because it did. You can't nitpick what you want the flag to represent. Okay? You can't nitpick that this is a flag of my heritage without addressing the fact that, okay, well, maybe your heritage was slave owners. Maybe your heritage was people who fought and felt slavery was right. You can't deny that. Okay? That would be like someone from England flying their flag and saying, oh, this flag represents my country, which is perfect, and completely ignoring all of England's history of having conquered and murdered and pillaged countless nations. That would be like me looking at the American flag and being proud of that flag. And I am. I'm very proud of the American flag. But I still acknowledge the fact that we have issues in our history. We have done terrible things in our history. We have gotten involved in foreign politics in ways that we assassinate leaders and put dictators into place. We have gotten involved in our own history by almost putting it into shadow. We always talk about these dark points in history, and the Civil War was one of them. We ourselves force our nation into shadow. How long has the U.S. nation allowed, the Ku Klux Klan to continue? How long has this nation allowed for the separation of church and state to be completely undermined? How long has this nation allowed for things to be fixed and put back into place, and then a specific leader or official has been allowed to come in and turn around and destroy all of that work? The prime example I'll give you is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln fought hard to remove slavery, to make life equal. And as soon as he died, what did Andrew Johnson do? Andrew Johnson took office and tried to undo everything Abraham Lincoln did. And that's undeniable. That's a fact. That is a fact. Reconstruction was the period after the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln was still alive. After Abraham Lincoln died, we call that post-Reconstruction. That's when Andrew Johnson just started to destroy everything Lincoln had done. And that's when we saw the reemergence of racial issues, starting with Jim Crow law, starting with the intimidation of African Americans to force them away from polling places. There's so many things that happened. And it's simply because America would not stand up and push back on that. You can't be happy of a flag. You can't be proud of a flag and nitpick it. You have to accept that flag for everything it represents, for everything that has fallen upon it. If you want to be proud of the Confederate flag, you do that. But you accept the fact that that flag stood for slavery. You accept the fact that that flag wanted to expand the slave trade. You don't just get to say, oh, this flag represents my Southern heritage. Oh, this flag represents the fight for state rights. No, it strongly represented the fight for slavery also. Just like the English flag for centuries represented the oppression of countless people and nations. Okay, you can't nitpick a flag. So now let's talk about, now that we've discussed what that flag represents, let's talk about how it has continued in our nation. Okay, so after the war, there was countless discussions from leaders of the Confederate States about why the flag needs to disappear and disintegrate. And my favorite person to talk about this is Robert E. Lee. So for those who don't know, Robert E. Lee was the general of the Confederate Army. Okay, he was, outside of the other handful of great leaders, great military leaders that they had. I mean, we look at Stonewall Jackson and other people like that. Robert E. Lee was the end-all and be-all when it came to Confederate leaders. Everyone knows who Robert E. Lee is. Okay? Robert E. Lee, after the war, spoke out many times about removing different monuments that had been put up for Confederate leaders. He spoke out multiple times about no longer putting up monuments of Confederate leaders. Robert E. Lee himself opposed Confederate monuments. And he speaks about this specifically in reference to Confederate war monuments. After the Civil War, Robert E. Lee had received several letters requesting his support for the erection of different Confederate memorials. Okay? And specifically, in, I think, 1866, there was request to build a monument to Stonewall Jackson. And he wrote back. He wrote about them building this monument, saying that it wouldn't be feasible. In fact, I have the letter right here in front of me. Let me read you this section. In December of 1866, he wrote this letter saying, "As regards the erection of such a monument as is contemplated," this is in reference to Confederate monuments, "my conviction is that however grateful it would be to the feelings of the South, the attempt in the present condition of the country would have the effect of retarding instead of accelerating its accomplishment, and of continuing, if not adding, to the difficulties under which the Southern people labor." Okay? In fact, openly in letters and in speeches, Robert E. Lee opposed Confederate monuments and favored erasing battlefields from the landscape. He felt that honoring Confederate leaders who were legitimate traitors to their nation. Okay, we have to remember this. Even though the Confederate States of America became a separate nation, they were still traitors to the American nation, to the United States of America. Just like the United States of America was a nation full of traitors to Great Britain. Had Britain won the war, America, all of the leaders of America would have been traitors. And that's exactly what the Confederacy was. They lost the war and they were a nation of traitors. And Lee said that honoring these traitors would do nothing to heal and accelerate the nation. It would only bring it back to the issues that had been fought against to begin with. In fact, Robert E. Lee spoke out about getting rid of the Confederate flag. Because after the war ended, Washington College, which he was the president of, wanted to fly the Confederate flag. Because the president of their college was the Confederate general. And he spoke out about it and said that we should get rid of the Confederate flag. Robert E. Lee did not want divisive symbols following him to his grave. In fact, at his funeral, there were no Confederate flags whatsoever. In fact, the Confederate soldiers that marched at his funeral didn't even wear their military uniforms. Robert E. Lee was not buried in his military uniform because he did not want the symbols of division to follow him to the grave, because he knew that they were symbols of division and symbols of the now left behind issues of the nation. He felt these issues had been fought about and decided, and that they needed to be left in the past. Now, I myself, as a history student, do not feel we should get rid of the Confederate flag. I do not feel that we should get rid of monuments. But they should be in places where they are relevant. If you're going to fly the Confederate flag, it should be on a battlefield where Confederate soldiers died. If you're going to fly a Confederate flag, it should be inside a museum dedicated to the Civil War. If you're going to have a statue of Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee, it shouldn't be in a town square. It should be in a cemetery where they're buried, or on a battlefield where they fought, or in a museum about the Civil War. Confederate statues, Confederate flags, that has no reason to be flown, erected, and presented on government buildings or in public squares. Now, if you want to fly a Confederate flag off the back of your truck, you have every right to do that. You do. You have every right to do that. If you want to fly a Confederate flag off your house, you have every right to do that. But that flag should not be flown in or on government buildings. That flag should not be flown on military grounds. That flag should be flown by the federal government on battlefields, in cemeteries, in museums. Those statues should be erected by the federal government on battlegrounds, in cemeteries, in museums. They should not be present in town squares. They should not be presented in city halls, anything like that. And that is a major issue right now. We have seen the news articles for the last, I'm sure, 2 or 3 years. If I went back far enough, I could find an article that a lot of these statues are being removed from town squares. A lot of government buildings are removing the flag off the top of their buildings. Okay? And people are upset about this because they argue, once again, the flag does not represent slavery. The flag does not represent division. But it does. That's exactly what it represents. For a government building to fly the Confederate flag, for a United States government building to fly the flag of the Confederate States of America, would be like if they flew the British flag on the White House. Actually, no. That would be like if they flew the American flag on Buckingham Palace. No government building in England is flying the American flag outside of, say, the U.S. Embassy or maybe the United Nations. But they're not flying an American flag at Buckingham Palace. Not unless, say, the U.S. president is visiting. They're not flying the British flag on the White House. They may have one inside for when a British official visits, but they're not flying it on the house. For us to fly the Confederate flag on a U.S. government building is ridiculous and idiotic. Because we are not the Confederate States of America, we are the United States of America. That is not our national flag. It has no business being flown on our national government buildings. Okay? And that's the whole discussion right there. I mean, that is the big political issue. The big political issue right now is, where is the Confederate flag permitted and not permitted? And people are having a hard time with this. I know that the United States Marines just banned the Confederate flag to be worn or carried or presented in any way on U.S. Marine grounds, I think is what the decision was. What that means is, if you I don't really know how the Marines work, but let's say the Marines have control of a battlefield, okay? Most of the battlefields in the US are maintained by historical societies, but also maintained and staffed by military officials, okay? Let's say, for example, the US Constitution, the USS Constitution in Boston. It's the oldest in commission warship in the United States. It is operated, defended, and controlled by the U.S. Navy still to this day. And when you go and visit it, there are naval sailors all over the boat, all over the grounds, everywhere. Let's say that that was controlled by the Marines. If you're a tourist coming to visit, you cannot wear the Confederate flag. You cannot carry the Confederate flag. Okay? The Marines have said the Confederate flag cannot come onto Marine-owned ground, period. It will not be presented on Marine-owned ground. That is the rule they put into place a few months back. And people threw a fit about that. But the argument was, we are the United States Marines. We are not the Confederate States Marines. And that's it right there. You would not fly any other nation's flag. The U.S. Marines do not fly the Iranian flag when they have a base set up in Iran. Maybe if they're sharing a base with the Iranian government. But if it's just an encampment, they're not going to fly the Iranian flag. Likewise, with, say, the U.S. Navy, they're not going to fly France's flag on an aircraft carrier. Okay, they may do that if France and the United States are doing some kind of exercise together. Okay, but they're not going to do that when they're just stationed out in the ocean by themselves. They're going to fly the American flag, not the French flag. Okay, and that's the point. That the Marines basically said, we're going to fly our nation's flag, not a nation that literally doesn't exist anymore and fought against our nation. The other issue is, once again, government buildings. A lot of people were upset because government buildings started removing the Confederate flag. They should not have the Confederate flag presented. They shouldn't. They are not Confederate States of America government buildings. They are United States of America government buildings. They shouldn't be flying another nation's flag. And I'm not just saying that for the Confederate flag. I'm saying that for all flags. But the discussion point today was the Confederate flag. Now, the other issue that has risen is the removal of the flag from like pop culture and things from that. I know that there was a discussion about the Confederate flag being removed from the top of the General Lee. For those that don't know, the General Lee is the car from the Dukes of Hazzard, and it has the Confederate flag painted on the top. Me personally, I see no issue with that flag being there. And my reasoning for that is, one, the feelings and issues that we discuss now were felt and interpreted different when that show was made. Okay? And to completely remove the show or change the show, that's not really necessary. And personally, looking at it, I feel that that doesn't necessarily help with addressing the issues. All that does is hurt the cause of addressing those issues, because then you have this kind of feeling that comes from those that are not in support of that, saying that, oh, well, everybody's just nitpicking, throwing a fit, you know. That flag being represented on a car in an outdated, no longer running TV show does not in any way affect the long-standing support for the outdated and ignorant views and stigmas that flag has carried. The Confederate flag being on top of that car didn't have anything to do with the show. Okay, it was just there. But flying the Confederate flag on a government building or in a town square, that is a completely different situation. That's not just there. That's being honored. The Confederate flag on the General Lee car is just there. A Confederate flag being flown on your county city building is honoring that flag. And the flag should not be honored. The flag should be honored as a piece of history in places where history is relevant. That flag should be flown on battlegrounds, museums, cemeteries where soldiers are buried. It shouldn't be honored in town square. And that's the big part of the argument. Where is it appropriate to honor this flag? Where is it appropriate to honor those who fought under this flag? Because obviously we want to give everyone in history the honor they deserve, even if they fought for the wrong side of history, the quote unquote wrong side of history. Okay? We still honor in America the British soldiers that fought, because they did give their life fighting for what they believed in. It may not be what we in America believed in, but they still deserve honor. Robert E. Lee was the general of the Confederacy. And while I don't agree that slavery should be a thing anymore, I still feel Robert E. Lee deserves the honor of having been a general and fought in one of the most historic wars in world history. Does that mean he should be honored in town square? No. But he should be honored in places of relevance, like a museum or a battleground where he fought, or his cemetery place. That is completely fine to me. But to honor him in town square is a different situation, because there are plenty of other people in American history that could be honored in that town square. There are plenty of people in, say, that town's history that could be honored in that town square. I live in South Bend, Indiana. Okay? Now, we've had plenty of choice characters in our history. Let's take John Dillinger, for example. John Dillinger was a mobster, okay, in Indiana. And everybody is in love with mobsters and gangsters, right? That's like the most entertaining thing to most people. Everybody watches, you know, Public Enemies or the Peaky Blinders. You know, that's like the big thing now. The Mafia and the Mob Show. You know, The Godfather was a movie that exploded because they were all about the mafia and things like that. We want to honor him, but he was a terrible person. Okay? So where do we honor him? Is there a statue of John Dillinger in South Bend, Indiana? No. Is there probably a statue of him at his cemetery or in a museum about gangsters and mafias and things like that? Sure, that would be great. That's what I mean. You have to find relevance. You have to find where it's appropriate to honor these people. In South Bend, we recently, in the last couple of years, had a statue erected of Martin Luther King and one of our local religious leaders, Theodore Hesburgh. Okay, Father Hesburgh was very prominent at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. There's a statue of the two of them holding hands when they marched together. Father Hesburgh is very relevant to South Bend. He's very relevant to the history, and he's someone that deserves to be honored. If they were to build a statue in honor of the Studebaker family and the Studebaker car industry, that would be very relevant in South Bend. That would be a very good place to honor them. But we would not honor, say, once again, John Dillinger in Town Square. We just wouldn't, because we know that he stood for things that weren't so great. And this is my point. It's all about finding where it's appropriate to honor these things. And again, when it comes to the Confederate flag and your private property, you have every right to put a sticker on your car, to fly your flag on your truck, to fly the flag on your house. If you want to put up your own Robert E. Lee statue in your backyard, you have every right to do that. But they shouldn't be flown in your town square. Shouldn't be flown on your courthouse. Shouldn't be flown outside your jails. Okay? That's the whole point. And that was the whole point for today's discussion. I wanted to talk about what is the big driving force behind the Confederate flag being a current political issue. And while a lot of it is interpretation, most of it is what is appropriate. Because I can take anything and interpret it about 50 different ways, if you let me, right? I could pick any flag from history and give you all the interpretations of it that I can think of. Let's take, the Betsy Ross flag, the first American flag, okay? Americans would have thought it was great. It represented freedom and liberty and unity of the states and, down with the oppressor and everything else. But to England, it represented, traitors. It represented upsetting the status quo and betrayal and stealing the economic kind of foundations out from under the British nation. Okay? That's the point. Those flags still hold meaning to people. Those flags still hold meaning to different events. And the Confederate flag, those events were extremely racially driven. And that's why so many people have that interpretation of it. But then you have people from the South or people from Southern heritage that does represent their heritage. Their great however many grandfather was a Confederate soldier, or, their great however many grandfathers owned a plantation and supported the Confederacy. That's fine. That's all well and good. And it's great to be proud of your heritage no matter what it is. But at some points, we have to push and shove a little bit. And we're pushing and shoving on that interpretation. Okay? We're pushing and shoving on the interpretation of that flag. And the issue is, the people who are shoving are a whole lot less in number than the people that are pushing. The people who are unhappy with the symbolism of that flag and the real history-based kind of representation of that flag are larger in number than those who feel that flag represents my heritage. That flag does represent your heritage, you're right. But it also represents all of these terrible things, and this is why we shouldn't be using it in government installations. And that was the whole point for discussion today, was to discuss why is why is the Confederate flag such a hot topic right now? And why should we not be flying it in government institutions? So I think that's going to do it for today. I have a whole list of requests that people have been putting in. I recently got a request to do a Thanksgiving special of some kind, maybe just talk about the history of Thanksgiving and maybe the dynamics of why the Pilgrims came to America. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that yet, and I know I'm running out of time. But I have a whole list of different things people want me to do. I'm currently working on doing some kind of panel discussion. If I can seem to get a video feed to work the way that I want it to. So everybody be on the lookout for stuff like that. I'm going to hopefully be releasing 2 more podcasts in the next couple days. Thank you for tuning in to this one. There is another one if you haven't listened to it already in the history section. So we now have 4 episodes out there, 2 in politics, 2 in history. The one for this week in the history section covered the life of Patrick Henry. Excuse me, I forgot what I was going to say right there. It covered the life of Patrick Henry, and the episode from last week covered the life of Salem Poor. So go and give those a listen. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Hit that notification bell so you can get live updates on when we post fresh content. Be on the lookout for our upcoming videos at some point before the end of this week. And if there's anything, any kind of content you want me to cover, go over, get in touch with me. I'll put it into my list. We are going to have a miscellaneous section soon, so that will be just groups of different random videos that people wanted me to cover different topics. So I'm willing to talk about and research anything. Let me know. I can put it into a discussion. Thanks everybody for listening. We'll talk to you soon.